So we've got a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
Okay, first one is, do you think there is any correlation between class and race?
I'm from Birmingham, so I'd like to go with what the Brummies have been writing about for the last 50 years. The Birmingham School of Cultural Studies identified race as a separate class faction in the 1970s, which basically means that you have to consider race alongside class. You can't collapse them into each other. They're separate, but they are related. So therefore, to address issues around racism, you have to address the history of racism, racialization, all of that, and you have to then intersect it with issues of class. The two are interrelated, but you have to also treat them separately. The danger is that if we just foreground class, we don't acknowledge the way in which you get racism within class context. The original work by the school in Birmingham, the Birmingham School of Contemporary Cultural Studies, identified the working class racism as an issue, and that's what led them to that viewpoint. So I'm just sticking with the good old Birmingham folk on this one. The London folk might see it differently, but as I'm based in Birmingham, I have to go out later in the city. I'll keep focused on what the Brummies have said.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got another question. So how far can we dismantle the educational system to enable changes without collapsing and causing any inability to deliver learning for all?
I think that discrimination somewhere affects all of us everywhere, and therefore to reconfigure the system to promote equality is good for everybody. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, that somehow a more inclusive way of learning, inclusive staff, is somehow disadvantageous. I think the two actually work positively together and are not separate issues. The best environments, the research has shown, for Black children is where there is the kind of inclusivity that I've suggested. Recent reports, 2019, from the University of London, demonstrate that the two work together.
Yes. So who should the stakeholders be in overseeing this and informing transition, and how many need to be from beyond and the formal educational system?
I think that's a really good question, and I'd refer back to my honourable friend David Lammy, who has made quite clear there are 200 recommendations already to implement from schools, government, other agencies. So the key issue is not who should oversee it. The issue is why aren't they doing their job? What has stopped the work taking place? So I don't think it's a case of looking for new stakeholders, but asking the question, what should be implemented and what needs to be done?
Okay, so.
Yeah, so question, there's lots of questions coming in now, Robert. Here's
Sure.
one. How can curriculum design promote social justice?
Oh, I think that's a really easy one to ask a theologian, to be quite honest. So thank you for that one. I think there are three ways in which you can do it. Firstly, you have to look at what is being taught. So if we're taking, for example, British history, then what needs to be taught is a more inclusive history. You can teach the history of the Caribbean, for example, as a way of being much more inclusive. That's the first thing, what is taught. Second thing is how it's taught. Now you can teach, for example, the history of emancipation from the Western perspective, which is the Wilberforce focus on the anti-slavery movement here, or you can teach in such a way that you look at what people did for abolition within the Caribbean. Caribbean historians talk about the slaves who abolished slavery. They don't know who Wilberforce is. Interesting. How you teach it becomes important. I think the third level of how you engage with teaching for social justice and curriculum design is then engaging it with the world outside, showing that the history, for example, is not static. So one of the ways in which we attempt to do this with more mature students, well, old students are, I should say more mature, not all university students are mature, sorry, university students if you're listening in, but is connecting it to the world outside. What does this history then have to say about what's happening in our contemporary world? Why is Colson's statue coming down? How is that related to this particular history? How is it related to what happened in the Caribbean? Do you see? So I think it's a threefold practice. What's taught, how it's taught, connecting it with the world outside is a way in which you can weave social justice through any learning experience.
So another question, how can we begin to address these issues in the early years?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's another really, really excellent question. That's a tough one to ask somebody who works with adults, but I'll give it a go. Just in terms of the experience of my own children, one of the ways in which they have enjoyed, when they first started school at the age of 5 and 6, one of the things that I noticed was that all the books that they read had no Black people within them. So from day one, for my daughter in particular, she felt that she was being marginalized in the learning experience. So I think the atmosphere at early years is very important. What kind of iconography have you got on the wall? What kind of images are played out in the books and material that you're using? Because I think at that age, I can remember back to my undergraduate days of dealing with human development, it's the environment that has a profound impact on the way in which human development takes place. So yes, I think it's clearly at that age what's in the books, what's on the walls, what language is used, and what is valued.
Thank you.
Oh, here's another one, which again is related. What can I do as a teacher, this person asked, to help ensure that my school is compelled promote Black staff into leadership positions? How do we break the cycle?
Yeah, I think going back to the categories that I used, I think what is central here is action. I think that within the legal framework, I know that within the legal framework that we have, there is room for, if you have a short list of candidates, and if you use blind shortlisting, you're likely to get Black and brown people on the shortlist. If you have 2 people of equal ability, you are within your right to go for the candidate who is underrepresented. So I think firstly, using the full force of the law and legislation that we have to promote diversity at this point in time. That's the first thing. I think in terms of atmosphere, it is about winning the cultural battle, what the Marxists call the war of positioning, demonstrating the importance of having an inclusive environment for all children. This isn't just for any city schools. This is for every school within the country. If we look at where people were coming from, the right-wing march a few weeks ago against Black Lives Matter, they weren't coming out of Hackney or Streatham or Handsworth, coming from the Highlands. So it's just important that we have this kind of thinking in every school around the country. So it's winning that cultural battle of showing the importance of developing a global and inclusive sensibility amongst young children and young people as part of their human development. And I think you win that through the kind of campaigning that you have to do, the kind of teaching that you do, the politicking that you have to do within the school, without saying too much more about that. So I think it is about direct action, it is about changing the atmosphere, and I think you do as much as you can within your own teaching, networking, organising, to dismantle any of the structures that work against inclusivity. So I'd refer you back to the lecture that I gave. Those 3 categories, those 3 tropes, I think are relevant to this question.
Thank you. So how can we tackle unconscious racism, especially in elderly people?
Oh, I don't know if they're all at school. I don't know what part of the school that is, but it's a good question. I think if we're talking about teaching staff, 2 things have proved really, really important here. One is the whole focus of unconscious bias training, which has its strengths and weaknesses. It has its fans and its detractors. So I think you have to engage people with training. That's part of it. I think the second thing is you never let them off the hook. I think you have to confront it. I think you have to out it consistently. And to do that, it requires white allies. I don't think it should be the sole responsibility of Black people to out it. It should be the white allies who are outing it and making it, showing why it's problematic. And also, thirdly, if we actually reward the people who are doing the inclusive work, then the people who are not, maybe will get the motivation. If they're interested in promotion, even in an elderly age, I'm not sure what that means. Those of us who are grey, I might respond to that in a way. But yeah, I think it's about demonstrating that there's value within having a disposition and a consciousness that's inclusive.
Robert, today, of course, besides being the day on which the world wakes up to the John Lewis's death, is Nelson Mandela Day.
Yeah.
Both John Lewis and Nelson Mandela learned a pathway somehow through all the suffering and hardship and opposition they'd faced to develop a forgiving attitude, and both spoke out very clearly about forgiveness being a key to getting the job done.
Yeah.
How do you reflect on that in terms of the current situation we're in?
I think there are three clear things at play here. Nelson Mandela and John Lewis both reached a point where they understood the importance of dialogue and realizing that the other, who they've been taught to see as opposite, were inside of themselves. And what I mean by that is they were connected as human beings. So in the case of Nelson Mandela, his route into engaging with his oppressors was learning Afrikaans. In autobiography, he talks about the importance of that experience. John Lewis, and for other members of the civil rights movement, it was a recognition that racism wasn't just something that black people had to deal with, but white people had to deal with. And therefore, the dialogue, and if you look at the civil rights movement in terms of membership, it was multi-ethnic. It was men and women, you know, gay and straight who were involved in that struggle. So I think the first thing that relates to this context is having these difficult conversations. And that's something that we're not necessarily willing to do. I think the second thing that we learned from both Lewis and Mandela is moral courage. Both of them were willing to do what was necessary despite it not being attractive or personally beneficial to their health or freedom. And I think that speaks to our context today. To break the cycle, it requires moral courage. It really does. It's going to take effort, energy, and bravery from people to do this. And I think the third thing, and it's kind of related to the first in terms of where we are today, there is a need to develop in teaching, amongst all staff, the kind of cultural literacy that's necessary for inclusivity. And that's something we haven't really done very well through our educational system, encouraging deep knowledge of the whole world, the way in which Go changed history didn't help, even in terms of literature. So I think it requires that kind of cultural literacy and awareness to engage with diverse people, diverse contexts, and understanding where people are coming from. The cultural literacy is deeply rooted, however, in understanding whiteness. You know, and that's the third point here is, you know, in terms of literacy, people racialized as white have to do the work of understanding how it came to be, how it works in the world, and why it's problematic in teaching. It's the first step. I mean, there's a little trick I do with my students where I say to them, mixed groups of students, I say to them, black students, tell me what it means to be black. And they'll go on forever because they had to deal with these issues, had to work them through. I then turn and say to the students racialized as white, what does it mean to be white? Complete silence, because it's like Fight Club. First rule of whiteness is you don't talk about whiteness. So we have to gain the kind of cultural literacy necessary to understand how to change the environment, how to take the knee, and how to protest. And that requires a first step for many teachers of reflecting on whiteness. Fortunately, there's some fantastic books on the market now, and webinars and other things to make it much easier now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago when Richard Dyer first started talking about whiteness.
This is a wonderful follow-up question from what you've just said. How would you approach decolonizing the curriculum in a way that it doesn't alienate those who have the power to bring about the institutional change?
Well, that's a complicated question. I'm going to try and answer it. If I've read it right, it's trying to, again, strike this balance between change that is inclusive but then doesn't upset the apple cart so much that the people who have the power work against it. I don't know if it's possible to do that, because I think all change that's positive, that's spiritual and empowering, upsets somebody who doesn't want to see that kind of change taking place. So it may not be possible to do that. However, it's also important to note that decolonizing the curriculum isn't about throwing out the history, it's enriching the history. And it's looking at how power works in the history of a given people at a given moment in time. It can make learning absolutely fantastic because you can make connections where students don't necessarily make connections. So I see decolonization, you know, looking at the power within, looking at how power, empire impacted on learning and the way in which we think. I think that's really, really empowering. It's a great tool to work with. The decoloniality, according to Mignolo, is about exploring the ways in which that experience of empire is still with us in the present. And that's, again, a great tool for learning, because then you can make students aware how these issues are all connected. You know, my name is Beckford. It's a slave name from the west of the country. You know, that's part of the decolonial, the continued impact. However, you know, there were some fantastic Beckfords, I should say, in the Caribbean who fought against enslavement, and that's why I keep the name on that side of the history. So again, I don't think that decolonization automatically means exclusion. It should mean inclusion into a broader, more enriching, more empowering history, English literature, geography that inspires all students. I mean, if there's one thing we've learned from these recent protests, Generation Z are into structural criticism. Look, even the kids who are into that band BTS did in Donald Trump. I mean, is there any more evidence you need to demonstrate that this generation are really interested in issues of structures, powers, and politics? You know, question the musical taste, but they get it. So I don't think that these two things, you know, can work harmoniously. You're going to change, you're going to upset some people, but the change is worth it.
Somebody's asked the question, Robert, where they say every time we talk about Black Lives Mattering, when we go back and we start that narrative with slavery, we refer back to slavery constantly. Is that in actual fact doing psychological damage, new, fresh psychological damage? And do we somehow need to move on from the slavery thing and begin in a different place?
I think there are two things that work. One, Black history doesn't begin with enslavement, but enslavement is like ground zero. So you have to take it seriously. So if I'm doing any kind of course on Black religion, we start with West Africa. That has to be the starting point. So yes, we need to rethink the historical trajectory of where we start at. Secondly, we still need to deal with slavery because it's not complete. It has not been resolved. And what I mean by that is, if you look at enslavement in terms of its main export, which is racism, well, we haven't undone it. So we have to go back to understanding how enslavement worked as a process of racialization to understand how we get to this point as well, you know, in terms of the present life. So yes, if you're going to do Black history, you've got to begin with West Africa, with my kinfolk in Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, Mali. You know, who else have I missed out? Missed out just about everybody else, you know, the ethnic group. Those people who had me over there, by the way, so that's why I give them a shout out. So we have to begin with that, but we can't neglect this history. Here's the problem. In my discipline, there are only 2 books written in the last 100 years by white scholars talking about racism and Christianity. 2. Now, I'm not mocking this other discipline, but there are over 50 books written by white scholars in the last 30 years on being nice to animals in Christian theology. Now, that suggests, even within my discipline, they haven't dealt with it. So we can't ignore it because we haven't dealt with it.
How do we move from accusations of playing the race card when challenging covert racism and unconscious bias?
Well, I've never really worried about anybody using that accusation against me, because it's usually they're doing it because they know there's an issue of racism at hand. I think that you have to out it, whether it's microaggression, whether it's structural, and recognize that if you do this with allies, that's really, really crucial. It shouldn't just be the burden of Black people. If you do this with allies in a structured way, you can counter both micro and structural aggressions and racisms within the context. But I don't think one should ever worry about the mudslinging. That is part of the process of doing any kind of work of justice.
So someone has commented that lots of children are scarred by racial injustice within the education system. And can this be equated with safeguarding? Do you think this can be equated with safeguarding?
Yes, that's what some people are arguing. The newspaper piece that I quoted in the presentation argues that we should teach racism as a safeguarding issue. It should be like health and safety, and recognizing this has a negative impact on children's mental health. Not just children, staff's mental health as well. You know, racism will make you sick. That's a well-worn pathway. So yes, we should take it as a matter of public health, and mental health. And if we treat it in that way, then it means we have to consider the kind of therapies necessary to restore and redeem people who've been damaged by it.
Robert, Leslie's asking here, what are your views on reforming teacher training to include cultural and non-racist training?
It's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer. It should have been done 50 years ago. It's a no-brainer. I think that every discipline where possible, look, even mathematicians are telling me that you can do inclusive math. I mean, they tried to show me how it worked through some formula, and my maths O-level was enough to help me work it out, but mathematicians claim they can do it. I think it's a no-brainer. It should be integral to teacher training, and I would go as far as saying any teacher training course that doesn't have this as a component is lacking. Any teacher training course that doesn't have inclusivity threaded all the way through, it's deeply problematic. We are then training our teachers not to be effective. If we're North America, they'd be a bit more hardcore. The people in my discipline would put it this way. They'd say we're training teachers to be racist. That's the Americans though. British a bit more polite. More indirect, you know, as one does.
Okay, so here's another question. How do we strike a balance between ensuring Black people do not bear the burden of dismantling racism and white allies not having their lived experience?
Well, I think that the training that could take place in teaching, being aware of unconscious bias training, training in terms of decolonizing curriculum, learning about white allyship, if all of these things were built into many of our degree programs, many of our teacher training programs, it should hopefully produce white allies who will do this work anyway. It should, you know, and that way, the burden shouldn't be upon Black staff to have to do it. If you don't have that training, don't have those kind of resources already, then I think within a school context, it should be the head teacher's responsibility to push for this. Maybe to say, we need to have training in whiteness. We need to work out how we're going to be white allies and how we're going to deal with this. Not just presume that just by virtue of assent, understanding the issue, you're going to automatically practice it. There's a fantastic example of this. In my younger days, when I was prettier and younger and used to work for Channel 4, making television documentaries, we once went through a process whereby they got rid of the people, the Black people, who were responsible for multicultural television. And they put in their place a group of white TV executives who said that they were going to do the work. Now, obviously, the programs got worse and less inclusive because just having assent, the idea that they could, intellectual awareness of the issue wasn't enough to do the work of anti-racism. And I think that's what I was hoping to show you in the video that didn't turn up by Marlon James. Anti-racism works against the kind of issues that people are gesturing towards here. So I think it's that kind of training and empowering of white members of staff so that they can do the work effectively.
So Patrick has asked for you to further elaborate on your point about making racism a safeguarding issue.
Well, look, I'm not an expert in safeguarding. I think I was half asleep when they did the training at the university that I was attending before. So I'm not an expert on this. But what I would say is this, two things. We tend to look at racist incidents as being individual acts of wrongdoing. So it's a moral lapse. We don't look at them as being structural problems that are ingrained within practices and processes. My understanding of making something a public issue is you make it structural. When an incident happens, you have to then quarantine. You have to then go through a series of processes and practices to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And then you look at how you then rebuild and restore afterwards. So I think it's fundamentally moving from this individual behavioral approach to a much more kind of liberal structural approach where we see this as being partly systemic. It's like an illness. Oh my goodness, we need to contain it. We need to check, has anybody else been infected by this? How much this, so it's thinking about it much more structurally, and therefore, who do we need to take out of this environment so they're not affected by it? You see? So I think it's thinking more of a program of action rather than just, well, you need to have a word with Jill or Jack or Jane or Malik or whoever and sort them out. It's thinking about it much more structurally. I think that's the way I understand it. I could be wrong on that. There's probably an expert on safeguarding, or somebody's just written their PhD on this and saying that's a load of rubbish, you know. But I'm up to that. But that's my rough understanding of it.
Yeah. Robert, there's two questions that I'd like to put together here. Patricia has said, as a safeguarding lead in my church, how can we begin to help children heal from some very bruising experiences in the classroom and playground? And then that's an interesting question. And then alongside it, one from Gilroy, who says this: how does the education system address the issues of mental health amongst African Caribbean people being part of their social experience here in the UK in particular? So
well, these are deep and really complex questions. These are the kind of subjects that you write dissertations on. They are seriously complex. I think in terms of the first question, and if I can try and put them together, I think that it boils down to the first point I made about atmosphere. If you have an atmosphere that is anti-racist, it should be therapeutic. And what I can say is this from my own experience, and it may not resonate, but it may be helpful. The times when I felt the atmosphere in school was more conducive was actually when I had teachers who had a deep interest, deep knowledge in where I was coming from, what I was interested in, and the issues that surrounded my life. And that wasn't just stimulating, it was healing. I've written about this and the Times Higher. My favourite teacher, Mr. Ralph. A teacher in school, Mr. Ralph, was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. They're long gone now, but you know, that was back in the 1970s. They were big news back then. And his thing was he knew our history better than we did. Fantastic. So we'd go into his math class, we'd be talking about Marcus Garvey. We'd go into, he taught us maths, so that's why we're all bad at maths at school. But we're all really quite keen on these political issues. He'd be talking, when he introduced me to Malcolm X, I thought it was an algebraic equation or something. I just had, so he used his knowledge of culture and it made his classes a safe space, a place where we felt we were included. So I can use that as an example. I think if we can thread that out into being some kind of policy, then it has questions for atmosphere. What does the school look like? What kind of language are we using? What kind of resources are we teaching in class? You know, because all of these things are subconsciously therapeutic. They help the child to see themselves in the learning, and that process is deeply empowering.
Yes, so there's a question here about recruitment, and Juliana has asked, how do you perceive a success strategy of support for senior leaders and head teachers?
That's a bit of a complex one for a theologian, you know, but I'll try and think to some of the experiences that I've had. What I would say in terms of my own life experience and work is that there's knowledge that's often hidden from Black staff about how to get promoted within a school. You know, and I don't mean hidden in terms of some kind of secretive way. It's just that people tend to keep the knowledge of success and how you develop things amongst themselves or their peers or people that they come into contact with. I think part of it for me is making that knowledge much more evident. How do you get a promotion? What kind of things do you have to have? At what time do you apply? So it's that kind of knowledge that I found in my own career to be really, really important. Now, just to be honest about this, I got that information from my African-American colleagues, not from my white British friends and colleagues within the UK. You know, so within my own experience, I would, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very keen to pass on, you know, my knowledge of failure to all the young scholars I mentor, you know, I pass this on, because so I think that's really important, understanding how the system works. There's something else though, which is much more nuanced. It's understanding how to play the game. And I think that's the kind of hidden stuff that we don't necessarily talk about, explore, or get exposed to. And that stuff can be really important for empowering Black staff. It can be the stuff that's really nuanced in terms of development that you don't, you know, that you need to understand and develop and work with in order to to get the promotion. So I think it's that kind of thing, really, and you can do that through promotions, through mentoring, you can do it through support, but fundamentally, you have to change the system. So you have to change the system so you can identify the talent. I'll give you my one Lenny Henry story. Lenny Henry has a stock lecture that he gives on diversity in the BBC, and I'm in it for some reason. And I'm in it because when I used to work in BBC Radio in the West Midlands, I made a real effort to talent spot young people who wanted to get into media. Now, some of them have gone on to do great things. Andrew Akinwolere, who I presented, one of the first black men to be a presenter in BBC, Blue Peter. I worked with David Olashoga before people knew David Olashoga was a historian. David Olashoga was partnering with me to make programs for BBC4. So I made a real effort to do that. That was changing the structure. They put somebody in place who could see talent within certain people. I should mention, some of them still owe me my 10% finder's fee. Which is a whole nother issue to go into, but we'll come to that later on. But the point was the structural change at BBC West Midlands and them encouraging me to engage with and find talented people meant that we changed the structures so that we could spot the talent in the first place. So those two things working together, empowering the individuals with the official and unofficial knowledge, but then we've got to change who makes the decisions. Who sets the criteria for what makes a good leader?
We're nearly out of time, so penultimate question here.
Fantastic.
Someone says, as a white person, how do I deal with other white people who don't seem to understand racism because they've felt oppressed in their own lives always? So they look at the black person who's oppressed, but nobody has ever understood their oppression.
Sure. I mean, we're not going to get into, people always want against the oppression Olympics, who's fastest, who's had it worse or whatever. But what I have found really useful is the work of Les Back at Goldsmiths University. Les Back has a book called Stepping Out of Whiteness. And part of the book explores his own experience as a working class man, racialized as white, and how he had to understand how whiteness was not just about his epidermis, but a set of privileges that he had. And so I think it's quite a useful resource for thinking about whiteness and how not all whiteness is homogeneous. If you are a white woman, you experience double jeopardy, gender discrimination, or not double, but gender discrimination. If you're somebody from a traveller background, you can experience different forms of discrimination, even though you're racialized as white. Similarly, if you're from Eastern Europe. So we understand that whiteness is homogeneous, but there's still the issue of underlying privileges that comes with that status. So I would say to the person, in my own experience, what I try to do is talk through talk and dialogue to find out what the real issues are. And if you feel oppressed because it's about class, then it's understanding that race and class are separate factions, and when they overlap, some people get it worse or better than others. So it's understanding the complexity of the situation, but then using that complexity to find points of connection to act together.
Thank you. Just to let you know, lots of positive feedback regarding your presentation.
Sure,
lots of tons of questions that I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to. But we're going to finish with this last question from Stephen. So what is the role of the governing body or trustee board in all of this?
To set the tone. They should be the starting point for setting the atmosphere. So the first question should be, who's on the board? Who's making the decisions? How are the decisions made? And if they can't give answers that or demonstrate that inclusivity, then the question should be, how do we get rid of them and get people in place who can do that work?
Great. And the same person, that Stephen says, should there be someone on each governing board tasked with the responsibility of making sure you get racial equity?
Yes, as an initial stage of transformation, but eventually working to the goal of equipping everybody to make those decisions, because racial justice is everybody's responsibility.
Great. Robert, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
honestly, truly, if we read you all these comments on what you've said, your head would swell.
Oh, no, no, no. Well, I tell you what, the West Indies aren't playing that well, so I'm pretty down on the, I'm feeling pretty humble at this moment in time. So no, but thank you for this wonderful opportunity to engage in this dialogue, and I hope that it's been helpful for all the people listening in.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much from us all.
Thank you. Thank you.